Hello, my name's Roisin, and these are my favourite books that I read in 2020. Hello friends, and welcome to this essential booktube video. I have been on booktube for 1 year now, and so I felt like I needed to talk to you about the top 10 books that I read in 2020. I managed from 115 books that I read in 2020 to whittle my list down to 10 books. I mean, actually, technically, it's 11 books, but since 2 of them are in the same series and I read them back to back, I'm going to count them all together as one book, and I don't think that's cheating too much. So, you can probably guess some of the books that I have on this list, and if you can, leave in the comments below which books you think I'm going to put on this list. One, I think is fairly obvious, but the rest of them, I would love to see if you can actually guess which books have made it before I get into the list. So, 10 books to talk about. 5 that are historical fiction, 1 non-fiction, and 4 pieces of just contemporary literary fiction. I think they're mostly literary. I'd say 2 of these are more, maybe 3 of these are more commercial fiction. But I will be putting out a whole 2020 stats video that should be coming out on Sunday after this, I believe. But don't ever make me stick to the schedule that I tell you in a video, because I never seem to be able to manage it. But without further ado, anyway, let's get into these books. So number 10 on my list of my top 10 favourite books of the year is The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. This also has one of my favourite covers of the year. It's absolutely stunning. And I read this when I was reading the Goodreads Choice Historical Fiction Awards. So if you'd like to watch that vlog, I will leave it in the cards above. The Pull of the Stars tells the story of 3 women during the 1918 flu epidemic in Dublin on a maternity ward. All of the women who are on the maternity ward, all of the patients who are on the maternity ward have the 1918 flu, and the people don't know how to deal with it, how to treat it. They don't even know that it's a virus or anything like that. This book is quite a quick-paced book about what happens over the course of 3 days on this maternity ward, with our main character, who is Nurse Powers, and then we also have the skivvy, who is called Birdie, and the doctor, whose name I cannot quite remember, who is a revolutionary and was involved in the 1916 Easter Rising. The book covers a lot of topics from the church in Ireland in the 20th century, the treatment of women and women's health in the early 20th century, particularly in relation to the Catholic Church, and it involves female friendship, romance, and the limit of a woman's opportunities in Ireland in the early 20th century. It is beautifully written, absolutely stunning. There are a lot of very graphic, visceral descriptions of birth and trauma related to birth, which is quite hard to read, but I think done quite exactly on the balance that you can feel the pain and the intensity of it without it needing to make me put the book down. And I'm quite a squeamish person, but I know a more squeamish person might have struggled more with it. I feel like the characters are really well developed in this, and it was a really strange reading it during a pandemic. There were posters that said things like "sanitation and ventilation will be our nation's salvation," which seemed really relevant, but also stuff about blaming people for the virus. A lot of the things that seem to have happened historically were repeated again today. The ending of this book was quite fast, and there was definitely more that could have been explored in it, but other than that, I really love this book, and it does also have queer representation in it, if that is something that is important to you. I don't think that's a spoiler. I think that I don't think sexual orientation can really be a spoiler, but yeah, I would definitely recommend it if you love historical fiction, particularly 20th century historical fiction, things that deal with women in historical periods and women's health more specifically. And if you want to read pandemic fiction during a pandemic, then maybe this is the one for you. Number 9 on my list is another book that I read for the Goodreads Choice Award Historical Fiction, and that is The Vanishing Half by Bennett. This has been one that has been all over BookTube and Bookstagram. People have been absolutely raving about it, and with good reason. It is a book that very perfectly walks the line between more commercial and more literary fiction. I would definitely class it in literary fiction, but it doesn't have the more obscure, complicated writing style. I don't know how to explain it other than that, but it's not something that is structuralist, like it's not based on the form of the novel as much, which I know is something that can turn people off other literary novels, but it definitely is so beautifully written, and every word on the page is definitely chosen for a reason. It feels purposeful but simple at the same time, and still very powerful and impactful. There were couple, and I mean literally 2 bits that felt a bit too on the nose for me, but that's because that is something that I personally am really picky about. Things being the meaning of a novel being stated clearly on the page is something that I hate and never want to see ever, but some people might be alright with it being there a few times, and I think I was definitely nitpicking when it came to this novel. The Vanishing Half tells the story of twin sisters who live in a town in Georgia where everybody wants to be light-skinned, and it is all about being... The town is completely made up of black people, but they're very light-skinned black people. And eventually these two girls escape to New Orleans and then end up separating. One girl marries a dark-skinned black man and has a very dark-skinned black child and ends up moving back to her hometown and raising her dark-skinned black child in this town that is obsessed with light skin. And then the other marries a white man and pretends to be white and raises her daughter without any knowledge of her past, as if she were a white woman. It is set in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s in the States, and it is about the twins and also their two daughters who, through machinations of fate, end up meeting and how that affects their life. So it does deal with things like desegregation and Martin Luther King that make it more grounded in the historical period, but I wouldn't consider it to be such a strictly historical novel as something like The Pull of the Stars is, but there are definitely aspects of the history that are important to it. One of the daughters dates a trans man, and that aspect of it is explored too, because this is all about because this novel is all about identity and perception, and how the way that you are perceived affects your identity, and how that affects you internally as well as the way that the world receives you. It is really powerful, really well done, and definitely one that I would recommend more universally than some of the other novels on this list. And number 8 on my list is a piece of women's commercial fiction, but done so incredibly well, and that is Queenie by Candice Cartie Williams. This tells the story of Queenie, a young black woman who grew up in London, in South London specifically. She's about the same age as me, and she grew up in the same place I did, but obviously she's a black woman, and it is about her experience with her career and with love. She's only ever dated white men, and it's kind of about her experiences in dating, interracial dating, as well as the trauma that she's holding on to from her childhood. Her friendships, female friendships, her relationships with her family, and her own mental health. This is very much a mental health focused book, and is one that I think could be very triggering for people who have had similar experiences to Queenie, so I would definitely look up trigger warnings if that is something that is important to you before you read a book. It is so well done that it can be hard to read at times. I found it really difficult, especially Queenie's relationship to sex and relationships, and the things that she actively chooses to do despite knowing that they are damaging to herself. Queenie's often doing things that you're like, oh please don't, because it's bad for you, but you can understand how she feels that that is the thing she has to do, or something that would help, or the situation, the way that her mind works, you can see why that is what is happening. And I think that it is such a vulnerable, raw novel. I mean, I know nothing about Candice Cartie Williams' life, but it feels like she understands this psychology so perfectly well, and it is heart-wrenching but also hopeful. And so I would definitely recommend it for that reason. Also, they go to the Crystal Palace fireworks, which I went to every year growing up, and I love seeing Crystal Palace in books because it so rarely happens. Next, at number 7 on my list is one I definitely wouldn't recommend to everybody, but one that I absolutely fell in love with. This is a brilliant book, and one that I kind of want to reread, even though I very rarely reread books, and that is Summerlight and Then Comes the Night by Kalmann Stefansson, and this was translated from the Icelandic by Philip Routen. This is a very short, very strange novel about a small town where 400 people live in Iceland, and it kind of is almost like a collection of short stories in a way, because different parts of it tell the story of different people who live in this town. It starts off kind of light-hearted and gets darker and more almost paranormal towards the middle, and then re-lightens again, mirroring the way that Iceland has 24 hours of daylight in the middle of summer and 24 hours of darkness in the middle of winter. There is a theme of light and dark throughout this novel. It is also about small communities, the way we watch each other, isolation, and it is very much a book that seems to be grounded in the real world and yet is a bit surrealist and weird. It doesn't feel like the real world, but it almost feels like a small town in Iceland could be this strange. And I absolutely loved it. I absolutely loved the writing, the way that it's told from a universal we, as if this small town is collectively telling you the story. There's a lot of sex in it, which is a bit weird. It's definitely not sexy sex, like it's weird sex, but in a way that I found really fitted with the tone of the book. And it was obviously one of my favourite books I read last year. I was obsessed with it when I read it, and it took me a while to get into the tone of the book, but once I was there, I was loving it. It was so funny, it was so weird, it was so there's a man in it who becomes obsessed with the galaxies and so paints his house black with stars on it that's a perfect map of the galaxies above them, that sort of thing. It was so whimsical in a way, but sort of a darkly whimsical book. I would say like Tim Burton, but less commercial. It was really weird and interesting, and I absolutely loved it. If you like weird books, books set in isolated places, books about a collection of a town, short stories, then I would definitely recommend this one for you. Number 6 on my list is another one that I would recommend pretty universally, and that is The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby DeRay. This tells the story of Aduni, who is a small girl growing up in a small town in Nigeria, and her mother has died. Her mother always wanted her to get an education, but her father doesn't have any money, and so he sells her to a man as to be his wife. And so there's a lot of abuse and sexual abuse in this novel, which I would definitely warn you about. But Aduni, there is a tragedy that happens in this house, and so Aduni runs away and ends up being sold into domestic servitude. And again, there is more abuse in this. The reason that I love this book so much, I think, is because of how powerful the character of Aduni is. She is the most endearing, most resilient, brilliant character that I have read about. She is someone that I deeply admire, as much as you can for a fictional character. She does have flaws, but she is so questioning, inquiring, curious, warm. She is such a brilliant character, and I absolutely love that about this novel. This novel does, as I mentioned, have a lot of tragic, terrible things that happen in it, and it is a lot about women's place in Nigerian society and the violence that is inflicted upon Nigerian women, the disrespect and the things that Nigerian women have to go through. And yet at the same time there is also hope and joy and laughter, and that makes it feel so real to real life. Aduni is searching just for an education, allowing voice, a voice that people will listen to, and her drive is palpable throughout the novel. I also love the way that it dealt with the intersection of sexism and classism in Nigerian society, talking about the violence that all of the women throughout society in Nigeria have to experience, all of the structural and physical violence that is enacted upon women, but how that is different depending on the class that in which they reside. There is a woman who is a powerful businesswoman who is still experiences violence at the hands of her husband and cannot leave him because she won't be taken seriously as a businesswoman if she is divorced, but still enacts violence against Aduni because of the class differences, and the way that that nuance is displayed throughout this book I thought was absolutely brilliant, and so I would definitely recommend it if you think you can handle the tragedy. Number 4 on my list is a piece of Ethiopian fiction, and that is The Shadow King by Maaza Mengiste. I read this back in February, so it was a long time ago, but it has endured in my brain as a book that I absolutely loved throughout this year. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize for fiction as well this year, and I think it thoroughly deserved it. This book is one of the best structured books that I've read this year, which I think is why it makes it into the top half of this. The skill of the writing is incredible. The Shadow King tells the story of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in the 1930s. Haile Selassie fled, and the people of Ethiopia had to engage in guerrilla warfare against these Italians, and the women took up arms as well. It is another book with a lot of violence, as you would expect from war, and violence against women, again, as you would expect from a book about war. It has so much nuance in terms of storytelling, violence against women, but also the violence of colonialism. There is a character in this book who is a Jewish photographer called Ettore, and he is the witness of the violence. He takes pictures of the violence for this captain who is one of the most violent of Mussolini's captains. But because of his Jewish heritage, his parents have been disappeared, and so he is under threat of violence himself. And it is sort of the things that people will do when they are under that sort of pressure. The similar thing happens with the man who is the head of the household and the head of the army, and his relationship with women in his life, but also with the soldiers and the violence enacted against him and his country. It is mostly about the women, though, in this book. It is about Hirat, the woman who comes up with an idea to dress this peasant boy as Haile Selassie, the Shadow King, and to get the country to rally around him in order to try and expel the Italians from their soil. This novel is so beautifully told. It is told in a way like an epic. There is an epigraph from the Iliad right at the beginning. There are sections throughout that are told from a chorus of women. It is a book that is settled into this history of our understanding of literary war, but instead of placing the men as the heroes, the central characters, it is placing Hirat and the other women as this central cast in a war story. It did in fact remind me of the beginning of the Iliad with the men in their camp. I felt like a lot of the camp scenes were reflecting that aspect of classical literature, but with women, and I thought that that was really well done. I also loved talk of dancing and the use of light throughout this novel. Light is such an important motif, and I think it is so beautifully displayed. The description, there are vignettes that are pictures that Ettore has taken, and the square of light is such a repetitive image throughout this because the Ethiopian guerrilla soldiers use lights to signal to each other, and I think it is so beautifully integrated. It is an incredibly well structured novel. It is one with not a lot of plot. And so I think if you're more of a plot-based reader, this one won't be for you as much. It is very, very slow moving, but incredibly, incredibly beautiful. Number 4 on my list is Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo. So I read Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo this year, and I didn't love it. Gave it 3 stars, but I thought I would try Mr. Loverman as well because I'd heard so many people rave about it, and I fell in love with the characters in this story who are so perfectly flawed and perfectly human. Mr. Loverman tells the story of Barrington, a man who moved to the UK from Antigua in the 1950s as part of the Windrush generation with his wife, but who has been in a relationship with his best friend, a man, since he was 14 years old. But he couldn't be gay in his culture, and he couldn't be gay in the 1950s in Britain either. And so he has lived a lie with his wife for all these years. The story is told from his perspective for the majority of the part, but also from his wife's perspective, and we see her inner life and the reality of her, which Barrington, who is definitely a misogynist, has kind of ignored throughout the entirety of their relationship together. Barrington is a charmer. He is Mr. Loverman. He is definitely has that bravado. He is a raconteur. He is a stylish, snappy dresser. I can exactly see the kind of man that he is, but he is hiding a lot of insecurity. It is built out as a wall to protect him from the things that he is hiding, and his innocence and his vulnerability inside is something that you absolutely fell in love with. All of the characters in the books are really, really human because they are so flawed. Barrington likes to laugh at other people, but we can also see the way that Bernardine Evaristo is showing us him and his insides, and the way that we can laugh at him and his foibles in the same way, even though he projects such a perfect image of himself. I think it is really well done, that subtlety there between the way that he's presenting himself, but the way that we can tell that he actually is. It is very difficult, I think, sometimes to tell from first-person perspective a story about a person, and we are to understand their flaws. It is another book with not a lot of plot. Again, not a great deal happens. Barrington is building up the courage to finally tell his wife that he's gay and to leave her. But it is really a story about relationships and about how people's flaws, how people's pride and protection of themselves can sabotage their relationships with all of the people around them. And I think it is so done with such warmth and such humanity, and I think that's what I loved about it most. Number 3 is The Mercies by Kiran Millwood Hargrave. This story is set in Finnmark, an island off the north coast of Norway, about a town, a very small town, where all of the men, or the majority of the men, are killed at the beginning in a storm, and the women have to fend for themselves. The Danish king is trying to spread Christianity through the country and to punish the Sami people for their difference in religion and for their independence, and is sending men throughout the country to try and introduce Christianity and subdue the people, and also to look for witches. Absalom Cornet has come with his new wife Ursa to this town in order to try and hunt for witches, basically. And this book was inspired by the real events of the Vardo storm and the witch hunts that took place afterwards, and is also about a queer relationship as well in this novel. It is beautifully slow moving. I absolutely adored this book. I love books set in isolated places and books about witches, so this book was definitely set up for me to love it, but I absolutely loved the writing because I felt like it was so beautiful, simple and pared back in a way that really reflected the landscape. The atmosphere of this book was stunning. It was so tense and dark, and we knew that something bad was going to happen towards the end, but there was also so much warmth and hope, and the relationships between these two women, and also other women in the community, the ways that they were expressing themselves without being able to say much. It was definitely a very closed down community without much freedom of expression. But the slow, subtle relationships, the things that they do say, and the suspicion, the tension, I felt like all of it really added to the atmosphere. Fell for these characters, Maren and Usa and Kirsten. I thought they were brilliantly sketched characters, done so simply but so beautifully. The horror that was spread throughout and the danger of these men, I felt the foreboding was really well done. I felt incredibly tense. So, coming to the top 2 now. I mentioned there would be one non-fiction, and it has made the 2nd place in my list of my top 10 books of the year, and that is Heavy by Kiese Laymon. This memoir, has been one of the books that I have thought about the most throughout this year. It is short and incredible. Heavy tells the story of Kiese Laymon's life growing up in Jackson, Mississippi as a fat black boy. His relationship with his academic mother, who is abusive and controlling, and his relationships with addiction and being fat, his eating disorder, his relationship with the academy and becoming an academic himself, the racism within the university system. It is the story of his life from childhood up through his early adult years, his vulnerabilities, his difficulties in relationships, his experience of racism throughout the 90s and 2000s in the southern US and in the northern US, his relationships with other people. This memoir is so vulnerable, so open, so aching, and also so skillfully crafted. Laymon talks about writing a lot throughout this memoir. His mother was training him to write academically, and you can tell that that skill is so tightly honed. The way that things circle back around, the repetitions of motif, the idea of the body, of memories, of the body politic, the body of the country, the memories of the country, the soul of the country, and the soul of him as an individual, family, cycles of trauma. All of that is so well done. Every word, every sentence, every part of this book means so much in the memoir, and you could read it again, I think, and get so much out of it. I really want to listen to the audiobook because I read it with my eyes originally, and I feel like hearing it in Laymon's voice would make such a difference to the way that I absorb the book. I think that memoir can often be better when you hear it from the person, but it was one of the books that has truly moved me, not just in showing me an experience so outside of my own, but also as a writer myself. An understanding of writing, I think, is so well done in this book. And truly, I cannot believe how vulnerable and open this is. This is the best memoir I've ever read. I don't read a lot of memoir, but this is one of my favourite books of all time now, and definitely my favourite memoir that I've ever read. So if you are into memoir, I would 100% recommend this book. It is incredible. And then finally, we come to my number 1 spot, which, if you have been watching my videos for a while, I'm sure you know exactly which book this is. It is Bring Up the Bodies and the Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel. Of course it is. I have been obsessed with this book since I read the Bring Up the Bodies in March and then The Mirror and the Light in April. I have a video where I review the whole series. I have 2 videos vlogging me reading the books. I have talked about these books non-stop. I cannot tell you how much I love these books. I think I was talking to Charlotte from Queenie Reads about maybe rereading them in March, but I'm not sure. We'll have to see, because I know that she's also doing like a Les Mis readathon, so we'll see what happens. But I'm obsessed. Hilary Mantel is a genius. I cannot understand how she crafted these books. I mean, I know it took her a while. And I understand why it took so much time. These tell the story of Thomas Cromwell. So it is the Wolf Hall trilogy. Wolf Hall begins with Thomas Cromwell's childhood, and The Mirror and the Light ends with Thomas Cromwell's beheading in the 16th century. Thomas Cromwell was the consigliere for Henry VIII. He was his fixer. He was his man. He got him what he wanted. And it tells the story of his machinations, of his growing too big for his boots, of the court intrigue in the Tudor court. It is so rich, so beautiful, so full of historical detail that you can almost feel the velvet, and you can imagine that you are seeing them in a darkened room. I love the darkness of it. I feel like the dark, not in terms of plot, but in terms of mood. There is so much darkness, it feels like it was written by candlelight, like you are reading candlelight, and also it feels like Hilary Mantel through that darkness is allowing us to understand that you cannot possibly know the truth of historical fiction. It is so meta. It is incredibly clever. If you want, I do gush for 10 minutes in that video where I review the whole trilogy, so I feel like I could go on forever about her brilliance. The ending of Bring Up the Bodies, the final line of Bring Up the Bodies, I can't remember it exactly, and my boyfriend's just turned off the internet, so I can't look it up, but my god, the writing just gets inside you and the plot is so good. I think that if you haven't read it, even though it's a trilogy in order, I think that Bring Up the Bodies, which is just over there, Bring Up the Bodies is definitely the most accessible of the 3 books because it's set over such a short period of time between the death of Thomas More and the death of Anne Boleyn. And so it's the most plot heavy of all of them. So if you, I would almost recommend reading the second one, then the first one, then the second one again, and then the third one, in order to get into them. But I'm obsessed with these books. I'm obsessed with these books, and I almost want to reread them every year. They are my favourite. I mean, I think I'd have to reread them in order to actually claim that, but I cannot express enough how much I love these books. And I think if you've been watching me since April or May, you will be well aware of how much I love these books. So I don't need to go on about them anymore, but there you go. So aside from the fact that my number 1 spot is not a surprise to anyone who has watched me for any length of time, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if any of these did surprise you, if I haven't talked about them enough, let me know in the comments below, because I'm happy to talk about for a full 10 minutes about any of these books, to be honest with you. And I'm so glad that I read so much this year that I managed to get to all of these books, because they really were exceptional and a bright spot on such a weird, dark year. Let me know in the comments below what your favourite book you read this year was, and whether you think I particularly would like it. That would be really interesting for me to know. Or if you think I wouldn't like it, that would also be interesting, and let me know why. My worst books and DNFs will be the next video after this, so hopefully you are looking forward to me ranting for a little while. So please remember to subscribe if you would like to see that, and to like this video if you liked it. I put out new videos every Wednesday, Friday and Sunday, and so I will definitely see you again soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!